Hello, everyone. So, we are covering chapter 10 of the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by me, Romeo, Trey, and Jacqueline. So, part 1. On his way to Boston, he met a tall and almost gigantic man he described whom he wanted to meet. That tall man had an opinion on their race. We shall win, for we have right on our side, while those who oppose us can defend themselves by nothing in the moral law, nor even by anything in the enlightened thought of the present age. And when they arrived at Boston, the narrator met many of the tall man's friends. So the narrator was impressed by the successes of all the men he met, due to the fact that they were all successful colored people living in the South. He then brings up the significance of the social life of his race, simply saying, "It's no disgrace to be black, but it's often very inconvenient." His next destination is Washington, the national capital. He reveals that it shows both the colored race at its best and worst. After Washington, he continued south to Richmond, Nashville, Atlanta, and then Macon. And during his trip from Nashville to Atlanta, he met a couple of men, a Jewish-looking man, a young professor, an old Union soldier, and a tall, raw-boned, red-faced man.
Alrighty, we got part 2. The narrator was speaking on a lot of problems that had to do with race. A quote he mentioned was, "A dozen darkies look worse than 50 white men of the same class." And he's basically discussing this, trying to prove a point to someone he's having a conversation with. Because in this era, it really was true. He goes on to mention how in an instance as such, a country usually goes on to emphasize their best, not their worst. So, for example, you're not going to mention your worst athletes in your country if you're, bragging to the whole world. You're going to emphasize the Olympians, like the number ones. And he basically is saying that the same thing should be done for black people. He arrived in Nashville and continued to meet more people. We're kind of diving into the trip. He went on a smoker ride, and a man from Texas was claiming that the Civil War gave black people the right to ballot but couldn't make citizens out of them. They bring up trying to get ignorant votes for Monopoly, and an ironic fact to the Texas man is that those ignorant votes are not from black people. The discussion quickly turned into a debacle about whether people are really equal or not. It seemed obvious to some, though they beat around the bush, and the Southern man did not take kindly to the idea. In the conversation, another man asked them, I think he was a scholar, who the Texan claimed Anglo-Saxon was the master race forever. And he asked them what's one thing that they did, whether that be art, principles, legislature, or even for architecture, and he could not name one thing. The Texan eventually goes on to pretty much say that he's not going to be convinced, and this just really exhibits a mindset thing, as I'll go on about. After the race conversation ended, the narrator was stuck and sick that the Texas man felt so strongly about this, but he did respect the man for, I guess, just maintaining his ground and not letting his opinion waver. The conversation did give him hope, though, that the problem isn't actually with black people. It's mostly just a mental block that's not based on truths. He finally arrives in Macon, where he meets a lot more educated black people who are used to living a more rural life, similar as when he arrived in Washington.
The main character attends a big meeting that is known as a social and religious function. It mentions how Southern women dress appropriately to attend church. This big meeting was attended by a lot of individuals for two reasons. Preacher John Brown is a powerful preacher and is also known for being an excellent leader of singing. This meant a great deal to the main character due to the significance it brought to him personally, meaning that the influence it reflected upon the development of colored individuals in America. He begins to describe the preacher's physical appearance and personality-wise. He mentions that throughout his sermons, he was able to transmit magnetism and imagination that is very free. And being this way, the preacher is able to carry out his messages he speaks upon. He was fascinated by his tricks and talents he performed throughout his performances in church. One of his greatest performances is the preacher performed throughout his sermons. It was the Heavenly March. This consisted of him holding his Bible under his arm and began to pace up and down the platform, and everyone else would follow his lead. The main character describes what these big meetings are like and the individual's experiences and feelings they demonstrate throughout the big meetings they attend. At the end of the big meeting, he had so many thoughts and reflections he wanted to write down, mainly the musical inspiration he was feeling at the end of the big meeting. After this, as he was looking for the proper area to sit down and jot down all of his ideas and thoughts he had, on this occasion, something unexpected came up and deviated his path of life, as mentioned. Instead of the main character taking the nearest train at the railroad station, he accepted the offer of a young individual who he saw at the end of the big meeting. He mentions that his conversation with the young man was very intriguing as they drove across the country. Throughout the conversation, he discovered that this young man attended one of the colored colleges in which, coincidentally, Shining was now a professor in. The young man discussed the work between the individuals and specifically hopes and his discouragement. As they drove across town, the young man pointed out where he held his school. He'd promised that he'd visit school the next morning. They finally arrived at the young man's home, and he described his home to be one of the best conditions the home was in comparison to what the town looked like. As night came and everyone was sound asleep, the main character took advantage of the quiet and free space available, and he began to write down all of his ideas still fresh in his mind, and inspiration he was still feeling at the time. And where out of nowhere he hears this horrifying alarm that is accompanied by footsteps at night. After being distracted from the alarming noises heard from outside, he listened to a variety of voices and a gallop of horses. He eventually began to worry and woke up the young individual. They both peeked throughout the window to see what was occurring. They both saw men being moved in one direction, then heard someone murmur there had been a crime committed, murder, rape. The main character decided to step out and get a better look at what was occurring. He noticed it was white individuals armed, and as time progressed, more individuals came by. By sunrise, there finally seemed to be some sort of action taken. He heard someone yell out, "Burn him!" He was surprised by how easily individuals were influenced into acting in an inhuman way towards other individuals. And then by noticing the action being demonstrated, the individual was shockingly surprised and without words of realizing what he was just about to witness, which was white individuals bringing torches, building up fires, and etc. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing, and before he knew it, he was now smelling burnt flesh, human flesh. He began to question himself: how could individuals from its own racial background could be capable of such an inhuman action? He thought of every possible reason that could possibly justify this sort of action, but there was nothing on earth that could possibly justify this inhuman action taken towards another human being. After witnessing this inhuman action, his mentality and perspective changed indefinitely. He went on to his next destination, thinking of whether, considering colored race being disclaimed or claiming white race, he decided to make a drastic change toward his physical appearance and questions. Do you think after witnessing the injustice action and committed towards the individual, it was a proper decision for him to drastically change his personal perspectives and appearance? Why or why not? Do you think there could have been something done to prevent the injustice action committed? Why or why not? Thank you.